Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down and re-indigenize ourselves to the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we love to be alive in.
Diversity and constant change are fundamental principles of life. When we go with them, towards them, we recover our humanity, we recover our joy, we recover our deep sense of remembering who we really are.
Linguist, author, and filmmaker Helena Norburg-Hodge is the founder and director of the international non-profit organisation Local Futures, which is a pioneer of the worldwide localization movement, raising awareness about the power of going local as a key strategy for restoring ecological, social, and spiritual well-being. Helena's books include Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's an eye-opening tale of tradition and change in Ladakh, or Little Tibet. And it's been made into a film with the same title, and the book's been translated into more than 40 languages and sold 500,000 copies around the world, which is a testament to really beautiful storytelling and insight, bearing witness to this crux that we're all becoming so aware of. You know, as Alistair McIntosh said in our episode with him, one foot down hard on the accelerator of progress and the other foot on a dying Indigenous world. And so this has been her life's work, actually, in Ladakh. Her latest book is Local is Our Future, Steps to an Economics of Happiness, and other works include Bringing the Food Economy Home and From the Ground Up, Rethinking Industrial Agriculture. She's also the producer of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. So do go dive into all of these resources. They're really incredible, and share them with your community. Invite dinners to talk about them, all that sort of good stuff. Since 1975, Helena's worked with the people of Ladakh to find ways of enabling their culture to meet the modern world without sacrificing social and ecological values. She was the first outsider in modern times to become fluent in their language and therefore gain a deep insight into the psychology of this shift that was happening and that has been happening. And since then, she's helped initiate localization movements on every continent, although I'm assuming not Antarctica, particularly in South Korea and Japan, and co-founded both the International Forum on Globalization and the Global Ecovillage Network. She's lectured in 7 languages and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, which is sort of known as an alternative Nobel Prize. So many awards, one for contributing to the revitalization of cultural and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm in awe of Helena's work. I really think everyone should be informed and a part of this movement. You'll hear at the end, actually, she invites me to become an ambassador for Local Futures. And this was technically after our rounded up conversation for the podcast, but I've left it in there because it really feels to me like an invite to all of you, every single person listening, to join this movement. And I took out my reply because I just gushed all over the place and excitedly said, yes, I'd love to, and distorted the mic and everything. So I saved you from that. But I'm leaving that question in there just to see if it plants a seed in your life and your purpose and your mission. I will just say that this conversation, it's coherent, it's beautiful, but we did have an insane amount of tech issues. And so you might notice from time to time, perhaps things were missing, the quality dips a couple of moments. It's mostly pretty good, but it does dip in and out in a few moments. And yeah, we lost a few chunks of this conversation. So if there is a moment where you think, oh, wasn't she going to finish that thread, it's probably because she did and we've lost it. But it does weave together really beautifully, and it's really, really worth a listen. I just wanted to give you that heads up. Local Futures are holding a global summit very, very soon. If you're listening to this when it comes out, it's at the end of the month, 29th of September till the 1st of October, I think. I'll double check. I'll put the link in the show notes, but it's a very accessible, beautiful summit. It's also available for live streaming online, but really worth going to Bristol in person if you can. They've got some incredible speakers, including Charles Eisenstein, Natalie Kelly, John Perkins, Bayo Akomolafe, Poppy Okacha, Ian McGilchrist, Vandana Shiva, Lila June Johnson. Oh my goodness, Satish Kumar. There's so many people. Rob Hopkins is there, who we've had on the podcast previously. It's going to be incredible. So I hope you guys can make it and join this movement. Before we dive right in, I'll just quickly announce that we do have one spot left on Forestlings, our foraging and fungi growing, beautiful immersion in the woods in Somerset next month in October. And we also have one spot on our earth medicine legal psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands due to a cancellation. So if you'd like to come and fill those spots and you've been intrigued, do head to rootedhealing.org/gather to find your way around and learn more. I want to do a big shout out to our podcast patrons. We've had a few new ones dribble in, and it means so much, really, truly, to have some costs covered for the show. And our goal is to have enough patrons to really take this resource to the next level and help it fulfill its mission. So please, if you're finding value in these conversations and they're really helping shape you and you're considering it to be a good resource, please do consider becoming a podcast patron, and I'll put the link in the show notes for all of these things. So yeah, enough of my intro. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Helena Norburg-Hodge. You've spoken about how over the last 40 years there's been a process with more momentum than the Industrial Revolution that's often overlooked, which is that of economic globalization. And I'd love to hear your reflection on how your time in Ladakh brought this quite crudely into your awareness.
Yes, well, very good question, because that's exactly what happened. And I had this enormous privilege and, in a way, burden also of arriving in a part of Tibet called Ladakh. It's the westernmost part of Tibet, belongs politically to India. And when the Chinese moved into central Tibet, the Indians put army on around all the borders of Ladakh or West Tibet, and it was sealed off. So in the modern era, it was sealed off for political reasons. Before that, it had been protected by high mountains and essentially being a region quite large, about the size of Austria, but with only about 100 villages and about 100,000 people. And that area was protected from colonialism and development because it was so remote. So I got to know a culture where there was no poverty. There simply wasn't the poverty that you would find either in New Delhi or in New York City or London. And the most remarkably vital, healthy, and vibrant, happy people I had ever encountered. I had gone out originally as part of a film team, and I was only planning to be there for 6 weeks, but I ended up staying and has essentially ended up staying till today, in the sense that my organization is still working with local people there. And what I was witness to then, speaking the language fluently, and sort of getting particularly an insight into the psychological effects of modern development and globalization, was within about a decade, seeing the creation of unemployment, the creation of intense competition, which led to conflict between different groups that had lived side by side for generations. I saw how the modern economy divides us from the land, from one another, and from ourselves. I saw this inner change.
You've spoken about this so profoundly in a way that I think demystifies this notion that a global economy is needed to combat poverty. I think of the book like Factfulness. I don't know if you've read that book, or there's a lot of resources out there to suggest that this is what's needed for everyone to come up to our standard of living here in the West and all this sort of stuff. What would you say to that myth?
Yeah, well, I'm very good question again. It's tragic that people have not been allowed, really, have not been encouraged to look at this global economic system in a holistic way, understanding its historical roots, looking at a process whereby global traders and global banks ended up extracting more and more wealth, starting in a very clear way with genocide, slavery, and enclosures. So what was happening in the already starting to some extent with the conquistadors moving out from Europe, whether it was Christopher Columbus or others, they were moving across the world to extract wealth for Europe to start with. So already in the 1400s, we see that expansion. By the time of slavery, we see that global traders are benefiting by driving people away from producing for their own needs, very often away from the land, and as I say, with slaves, and in Europe, enclosures where villagers were suddenly told that their common land was no longer theirs, and where they were driven off the land to become cheap labor for the production using globally traded materials. So once we understand that global traders had this ability to manipulate and control from the top, we then need to start looking historically at what happens later on, which is that this expansionist economy leads to wars, leads to a hunger for more and more energy. And by the time of the Second World War, we're talking about fossil fuels playing a major role. And we're talking about, after the Second World War, governments sitting down around the table where they set up the World Bank and the IMF. And now they were instituting trade as a central part of extracting wealth for the few, but the politicians and most people involved with this were actually told that this is a way to avoid another world war. It's a way to avoid another depression in our countries. What we must do is so-called integrate all economic activity so that we no longer are fighting, as it were, for our own resources. It's sort of understandable that people thought this was a good idea. Later on, so then they basically instituted these trade treaties, a process of trade treaties that, in the name of free trade, pressured governments to open their doors to giant monopolistic corporations and banks, to lose more and more control of their own national economies. And after the Second World War, gradually it looked as though those countries in the so-called Third World that had been colonized were becoming independent. They were gaining freedom and independence. But again, when you study this economic structure, you'll see that no, by that time, they were supposedly given political autonomy, but because they were indebted, completely enclosed and indebted economically, they actually were now, as I say, enslaved by debt. Later on in the 80s, there was another big push by big business to expand even more deeply, even more rapidly, and to have access to more land, more resources, more freedom around the world. And so there's this era that was labeled globalization that started in the 80s. And it was particularly with a treaty called the Uruguay Round of the GATT, and the GATT is a general agreement on tariffs and trade. Most ministers, most environmental activists, most people all together had no idea how destructive these trade treaties were. So, in my case, having seen what was happening in Ladakh, it became very obvious that there was something wrong going on, because among many other changes, I saw food transported to Ladakh over the high Himalayas, transported for weeks, coming in and selling for half the price of food from a 5-minute walk away. This opened my eyes to trying to understand, how is this possible? And I then realized I was invited around the world because people were interested in what we were saying based on our experience in Ladakh. And I found literally all around the world that local food was more expensive than globally transported food. And I saw how there'd been this terrible inversion of a completely false economy that suited the wealth creation by global corporations and systematically was impoverishing essentially the majority of people. So now that myth is still being held up, that there's still arguments that we need this global trade to, as it were, lift poor countries out of poverty, it's a myth, and we have to talk to people on the ground. We have to look at some real solid ways of measuring wealth, because we are caught up in a measurement called GDP, which literally goes up with breakdown. So if you and I decide we're going to plant a garden and eat fresh, healthy food, that's bad for GDP. Whereas if we get cancer and we need to have regular chemotherapy, that's good for GDP. Even worse is that if you and I are robbed, someone comes in and robs everything in our house, and we have to go and buy new furniture, new television, new whatever, fabulous for GDP. So crime, ill health, environmental breakdown. If the water is so polluted, we have to buy it in bottles. Again, it's good for GDP. So I hope that listeners will think about this and will, really become what I call big picture activists.
There's a few myths I feel that are also attached to this notion that we need to industrialize agriculture or continue to have industrial agriculture to feed the world, and perhaps overlooking what people may not even know about are these indirect government subsidies, which maybe you could speak to. This myth that carbon footprint increases as we localize. I've heard some people talk about that. So I'd love for you to speak to this.
Yes, it's just so tragic that there are vested interests and think tanks that are completely linked to continue on a path of extracting wealth for global business and corporations. And these studies that they come out with, they literally came out with a study telling us that, oh, it's better to buy lamb from New Zealand in England, because in England they use brown energy, but in New Zealand they use green energy. So don't worry about the emissions from New Zealand to England, because as though every farm in England that would be producing lamb for local consumption would be using a lot of brown energy. The truth is that these studies simply do not look at real choices and real options. And also, I think I might have mentioned already that the emissions from global trade are nowhere included in the climate negotiations. And essentially, no one is measuring the emissions from transporting food back and forth across the world. And another study, said, oh, don't worry about sending shrimp to Thailand to be peeled from the UK. Because if we were to peel shrimp in the UK, we would use machines, whereas in Thailand, they're doing it by hand. So the net result is that emissions are lower. Now, the arguments that they're coming up with more recently are saying, oh, no, no, don't look at the shortening of distances between the farm and the table, because those emissions are not significant. Again, remember that there is no calculation of the emissions from a globalized food system where countries routinely import and export wheat, butter, milk, beef, routinely import and export. There's no one measuring those emissions. So we just desperately need some common sense and some clarity about what's going on. We also need to look at the fact that the global food economy, which has been supported by our governments in a particularly destructive way in the last, well, since the 80s, has meant imposing monocultural production, just one thing, thousands of acres of wheat, animal factories with thousands upon thousands of animals piled on top of each other. Now, these monocultures couldn't be more toxic and destructive, couldn't be more wasteful. And yet, the truth of that is getting covered up. We just desperately need to try to get the word out, the truth out about going to the small, diversified farm. By the way, one of the ways to visit one of those farms would be to watch the film, The Biggest Little Farm. It's a beautiful demonstration of what can happen when you turn land that has been essentially turned into desert because of monocultural, fossil fuel-based production. And let's remember also that with monoculture, it's so unnatural that calls for toxic chemicals. Whereas when you encourage diversification, you're actually creating space for wildlife right on the farm. You're actually reducing the need for pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. And per unit of land and water, diversified systems could always produce more than monoculture. And this goes completely against, what people believe when they see these huge and big machinery. They believe, oh yeah, bigger produces more, and there's so many people on the planet, and this is why we must go for more industrial and bigger agriculture to feed the world. What's so wonderful is when you realize that actually we are on a crowded planet. We're about 8 billion people. And in order to feed ourselves, to provide building and scale and more human hands and eyes and ears and bodies on the land, so small diversified farms with lots of people doing work that is so much more enjoyable, because when you're not sitting on a giant machine with headphones on, but you're actually part of a community, and when you're on a small diversified farm with community, you are talking about work which every single day is different, and you're responding to this incredible diversity, this richness of the natural world, which is our home. And this is also why people who are engaged in these local food economies feel so regenerated and love the work so much.
Mm.
We have a little film called Local Food Can Save the World, which lays out these systemic differences between the global food system that tragically our governments are supporting around the world, and the horrific waste from it, the cruelty to animals, the need for toxic carcinogenic chemicals. And when you contrast that with more localized systems, which again doesn't mean, they have to be the distance between the farm and the table has got to be 5 miles or something. Regional, economies, which is how we fed ourselves for our entire evolution. Of course, there was some trade and some specialization, but these more diversified, smaller scale systems, when you contrast them with this big global system, it's just a complete win, 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 both for ecosystem healing, reducing climate emissions, reducing plastic packaging, and increasing incredible, turning, desertified land into thriving ecosystems, very productive ecosystem. So that's what this film, The Biggest Little Farm, shows. And our little 3 minute contrasting global, the global food economy with local food systems is a good way to really see this in a holistic way. And it's a useful tool for spreading the word, because we are at a very important crossroads right now where governments are still continuing to adhere to an outdated notion of growth, adhering to this measurement of GDP. They are using our taxes to subsidize the infrastructure that is bigger and bigger and faster, increasing the size of the ports, of the airports, the superhighways, all of it linked to supporting Walmart. And in each country now, there might be a duopoly of, two giant supermarket chains, but even they are heading towards mergers. And now, in the meanwhile, the pressure is on to argue that we can't afford agriculture at all, that we actually need to go towards lab produced food, fermented bacteria. And this is being promoted actively. Just today in The Guardian, an article about how New Zealand, because of climate change, is going to turn towards lab food. And they're arguing that it's going to have so much less waste because apples, for instance, won't bother having an apple core. You won't have. I mean, it's hubris, it's madness beyond belief. But it's because it's a system where over specialized science is linked to a vast techno-economic system that people don't understand. So the good news about this is that the only reason it's happening is because most people are not looking at this system. So it can be a bit depressing and a bit overwhelming to actually look at it and understand what's going on. But when you realize that the majority of humanity does not know about this and definitely would prefer to subsidize local, fresh, organic food from thriving farms that have space for wildlife, that clean the water, that heal ecosystems while healing people. Now, that's what I can guarantee the majority of people would vote for if they could have clarity about that politics today without an understanding of the economy has become meaningless.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, both left and right have been promoting the same global system without looking carefully at what it actually means.
I wish we could vote you in. I really do. I really, really do.
The way to vote for this is to spread the word.
Yeah.
Realize, and you have to step back a bit and think about the fact that most people have no idea that there are trade treaties where governments are signing in black and white. We will not do anything that will reduce your profit. They are saying this to Amazon, to Walmart, to Coca-Cola. And if we do, you can sue us. Now, most ministers in most governments don't know about this. 99% of voters don't know about it. You and I know how they would vote if they had the choice. So what we need to do is to get the big picture out. And that's by sharing these podcasts, it's by sharing the films. And
Yeah.
because it resonates so much with people. If we focus more on spreading the word, not only about the big dominant system, but about these wonderful, inspiring examples that are proliferating all across the world. That is the activism that could make a real difference very quickly.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I even think of how you've spoken in your most recent book, Local is Our Future, about how even health and safety regulations and land use regulations can debilitize the more small scale farming because, for example, battery hen farms need extreme hygiene measures because you've got all of these hens in one held space in this huge barn right next to each other. So, of course, disease is rampant. And then they project that same level of needed sterilization onto a small farm that simply doesn't need that same level because it's not working within the same perpetuation of disease. And I've been inside battery farm hen barns where they're literally held in these cages and it's it's just awful. And I grew up on a farm where we had small scale chickens and Dexter cow beef, and we couldn't afford, there's no way we could have afforded to be organically certified, but it was the most paradise led farming structure you could have possibly imagined. So just even breaking down those things would be so important. You might have something to say to that, but I'd love to weave it back to Ladakh just a little bit because you've spoken so profoundly also about the rise of extremism that's come with this globalized economy. I'm thinking especially about your reference to the Buddhists and Muslims and how they were living together and how that changed with this momentous shift.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm so glad that you've read that and that you understand the relevance of it. And yeah, when I first arrived in Ladakh, and I literally remember sort of having tears in my eyes when I saw how the Buddhists were going to celebrate with the Muslims their Eid celebrations and bringing them food. And here they were, communities that had been living side by side for 500 years. And they were very clear, you're Buddhist, I'm Muslim. And there was also a tiny group of Christians there. I witnessed how, when people were made insecure, both psychologically and in their livelihoods, over a decade, I saw this tension building up between different groups. What was happening with this modern economy was that suddenly everyone was being encouraged to go into the city. So they were leaving all the land based work that had, for thousands of years, provided for their food, for their clothing, for their shelter, for their medicine. I mean, some of the medicine was herbs and minerals and things imported over longer distances, but it was human scale, it was in their own hands, they were not dependent on this extractive system. So people were interdependent with each other. They actually depended on each other in this human scale way with direct relationships. They knew that Mohammed had this shop and that Norbu had this wheat to sell or these beans to sell. Now they were pushed into the city, and suddenly, thanks to modern schooling, they were trained to do jobs that were essentially bureaucratic, administrative. If they went on to university, they were trained to become engineers using the same plastics, cement, steel from a global industrial system. So all the materials had to be imported. If they studied agriculture, they were trained now to use literally Jersey cows were imported. Jersey cows that couldn't even go to the grazing lands, and now you had to import industrially produced pellets. Suddenly, they were so dependent on this top down system that competition for scarce jobs, scarce resources started shaping their relationship. Now, if you had Muslims in charge of the government, they would favor Muslims, and where there were Buddhists, they would tend to favor Buddhists. and competition rose. And what I saw very closely was that it was the young men who became most angry and started developing anger and even hatred of the other. And they would carry the message back home and say, the Muslims are meeting in the mosque, they're plotting how to destroy us. And so within some more years, Buddhist grandmothers were saying to me, we have no choice. We have no choice. They're going to exterminate us if we don't exterminate them. So I saw firsthand this shift. It was over about 10 years. The tensions became very intense after about 10 years. And then after about 14 years, there was bloodshed and people literally killing each other. And I also happened to have been working in Bhutan over a 5-year period based on the work we had done in Ladakh. And in Bhutan, you had Hindus and Buddhists who had lived side by side for a few generations, not quite as long, but now, again, the centralization, the top-down structure that created competition for jobs and that created psychological loss of identity and self-respect that had broken down the community fabric, which is essential for our emotional well-being. There, too, Hindus and Buddhists were killing each other. I also saw in my native country of Sweden that as the global economy had made more and more inroads, which included bringing in advertising and American violent films, which when I grew up weren't allowed. Sweden didn't want that commercial television. They didn't want that kind of violence. And when it was opened up to the free market, friends of mine noticed the impact on their teenage children. So it's in many countries like England and America and so on, it's a little harder to see the progression and how this global media dominated by violence contribute to polarizing gender roles, literally bringing in Barbie and Rambo at one point. This is particularly at the beginning of the globalization systemic expansion from the 80s. I witnessed this sort of Barbie and Rambo phenomenon. Also, I think the polarization of gender through this commercial system about gender today. And
I'm losing you a little bit, but you had mentioned about these teenage boys, and I think it was Ladakh. They were singing songs about how beautiful their mothers were and their mother's breast milk, these 14-year-old boys, and just what a different paradigm that is.
Teenage boys would coo over a baby like a grandmother would, and they'd happily walk hand in hand, with their 80-year-old grandmother. There was a completely different attitude to what it was to be a young man versus a young woman. And then I saw how, again, the advent of these Barbie doll, in a very short time, created this idea that as a man, you couldn't cry, you couldn't be seen dead with a baby and your grandmother. It's very interesting to see it also in the sort of new local, in some of the eco-villages. You see that the gender roles are not so polarized and that women have essentially have greater respect, have more power, have more influence. Their voice, their ability to deal with complexity, their skills meant that they played a fundamental role in everything to do, of course, with how we rear our children, but also how we rear our food. And as it happens, that was also connected to the fiber and the building materials, essentially all our needs, the wisdom of women, the voices of women. And there were studies back in the 70s and probably started disappearing again with the later stage of globalization, looking at how the technology-based, fossil fuel-based, monocultural production and the entire package that came with this urbanizing fossil fuel-based, and it actually polarizes gender so much. Very, very dangerous process that has been happening, and it's been happening hand in hand with the overemphasis of the left brain development, as my dear friend Ian McGilchrist says.
Yeah, his work is, it's so well articulated, this idea of being so dominated by left brain mentality. You've also spoken about the role that mainstream school plays in this overculture of shifting from cooperation to competition, and reading Ancient Futures a while back, just feeling into a fundamentally different attitude of cooperation and togetherness and an understanding of the other within Ladakhi culture, just recognizing the role that mainstreaming, that schooling has, that putting children in the same class with the same age peers, all of this is playing a part into it. And obviously you've shared the message, like, we need to raise awareness about this, we need to share this, we need to engage with the films, the books, the practices that are really paving the way for how things could shift. What would you say to people who are also just trying really hard with living costs and children and having a family and possibly living in a nuclear setup or trying to do community in a new way, but who are struggling, who's just struggling to avoid supermarkets, for example? That in itself can be such a big ask.
Our fundamental, embodied, soul-based, wisdom-based knowledge that is taking us in the right direction. It is happening.
Yeah.
However, if you are there, with a mortgage, with children, have almost no time to sort of start living differently. If you can't afford to go to the farmer's market across town and pay more for your food, what you can do is just give a few minutes or a few dollars to help get the word out, not just about this amazing localization movement that is expanding across the world from the bottom up, a people powered movement, and as I say, a very feminine people powered movement from the bottom up. Also, spread the word about the prison that is keeping you running faster and faster and faster so that you can't afford to do the right thing. You don't have the money to do the right thing. You don't have the time to do the right thing. You can give a little bit of time, a little bit of money to support the building of a movement that is not just raising awareness about the beauty and the joy of this worldwide localization movement, but making clear, concise, holistic pictures of why we are running so fast, why we are feeling depressed, why our health is deteriorating. And it's deteriorating for a multitude of reasons, including that healthcare has become a type of mafia of selling expensive pharmaceuticals instead of allowing us to have the fresh, healthy food, the fresh air, the peace of mind, the exercise and mobility that our bodies long for. There's a picture here that we can find it as I did, in Ladakh, in Ancient Futures, that gives us a roadmap that is so clear. And it's not a roadmap towards a static utopia and this one way of doing things. It's about understanding the magnificence, the joy of going with the flow of life, not with a man made system that started with force, that's imprisoning us in ideas that confuse us and contradict everything that life is about. We now have this choice between supporting a man made system taking us away from life, away from our needs, or a multitude of ways of doing things, localized, human scale, community based, that rebuild the fabric of interdependence and that go with the flow of life. And that means not one system, it means the deep understanding that we have to become more humble, we have to become more, if you like, small as we embrace our relational way, our relational being with other human beings and with the plants, with the animals, with life around us. Um, Diversity and constant change are fundamental principles of life. When we go with them, towards them, we recover our humanity, we recover our joy, we recover our deep sense of remembering who we really are.
So busy your hands and fill up your heart. Do what you can. Play well your part. Play well your part. You've spoken about this just lie that accelerating technology is improving and simplifying our lives when actually it's speeding our lives up, and we're almost expected to work as fast as our laptop works. This notion as well, and the rise of AI, but that will be a whole other episode further down the line. But I'd love to navigate people to Planet Local Summit in Bristol coming up.
Yes, I mean, please join us at the Planet Local Summit in Bristol or online. It is a remarkable, amazing event that is bringing together voices from every continent, and we are so thrilled by the response we're getting. There are people buying tickets to come to Bristol from Brazil, from Iceland, from Transylvania, just to listen. And we're finding that it is really a remarkable coming together. And we also see the hunger for this deeper dialogue across what is an artificial divide that has become more divided than ever between so-called global south and global north, or the so-called developed and so-called undeveloped parts of the world. There is such a need for face-to-face dialogue, for deeper sharing and deeper understanding of what's going on. When you have more of an experience of both sides of the world, in other words, those peoples who have not been quite so affected by this technological, urbanizing, commercializing, top-down system, and when they have a chance to see that in the parts of the world that have been presented to them as paradise, New York being like the pinnacle of a sort of utopian existence on this planet, once they realize what the realities are for many people in New York City and so on, they realize that they should not buy into the narrative that tells them that they're stupid and backward and so on. There's a whole spectrum of ideas that can strengthen us on both sides of this artificial divide to collaborate for truly sustainable, ecological, and community-based ways of living. And that's happening, but it's a very rare opportunity in Bristol to actually be part of this larger scale, face-to-face, global coming together.
I feel like everyone who has resonated with this conversation, which I think will be every single listener, should try and get there. So thank you so much for your time, Helena. I'm just in awe of the work you're doing and how you're sharing. And I absolutely want to spread the word in every possible way.
I hope you will join us and become an ambassador for Local Futures. And I really, really appreciate your questions and your deep searching. And I think your inquiry into all of this almost certainly has something to do with the fact that you experience life on a farm. And this is part of what the whole movement is about now, is that even from big cities, as people discover the joy of reconnecting with the sources of their food, they again, they're recovering a bit of their soul, of their humanity. In our entire evolution, of course, we were connected to that. And as long as we rebuild the relationship between the city and the country, not everyone has to be a farmer, and there are lots of people who might not enjoy that. But of course, we've got to rebuild that fabric of connection. I would argue right now that more important is that women like you are willing to outline and spell out the system that we need to say no to. You were saying about how you couldn't afford to be organic. This is why I've been battling Patrick Holden and the Soil Association forever, because they were going around and still go around telling people you should pay more for your food, rather than saying, do we really want our taxes to subsidize toxic food from the other side of the world? Let's look at these regulations, and the regulations that you mentioned are just, it's almost every single regulation now, which includes racism. What we're getting is money and regulations spent that fundamentally serve this extractive system. So if we could be clearer about that, we could make miles of progress in making it possible for us to live in a way with that nature connection. What's very worrying is that right now, at the very top of the corporate world, and from various projects and programs I've spoken on with the UN and so on, they got all the right language now about we must learn from indigenous culture, we must localize, we must, regenerative is everywhere. And it is very, very insidious, because they can speak this language while the actual profit making couldn't be worse than it is right now, because they have no rules and now tons of money to play with. I think the biggest problem is that most people subconsciously in the West have been brainwashed into believing that this is a type of progress and that the technology is somehow independent, inevitable change coming out of evolution, literally evolution. That's what Yuval Harari is to persuade people in a subtle way. Clarity we need to have is that because we use this technology now, that doesn't mean that we are there for, because the message that's being put out is if we're using our, laptops, now we're on Zoom or whatever, then of course we have to embrace it. So again, we've got to step back and have clarity about, we don't want it to go further. We want to use these tools to say, we don't want the taxes and regulations to push this even further. We don't want to use our taxes to build these 5G towers. And we want to use this technology for now to get out a message that will help more people live with less dependence on this technology. And exactly what mix of technology and whatnot needs discussion. And that's what Tristan Harris, who made the social media film, is trying to say. He's saying we need a moratorium on further deployment of robots. But anyway, it'd be lovely to see you there, and I'd love to collaborate more with you. You have very special insights and a very special background. So really appreciate that you contacted me, and hope maybe you can be a sort of ambassador for Local Futures.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. Through deepened imagination, consciousness expansion, and cross-cultural wisdom exchange, we explore human soul ecology to ignite collective healing, nature awe, and interconnectivity. We offer nature-immersive ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, integrative healing courses, and a growing collection of resources rooted in regenerative reciprocity. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. please do consider joining our Patreon community, where you can gift forward and support our work in exchange for bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution, which can be as little as £2 a month, helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough gifting community to really go the extra mile with this show and its purpose. Come follow us on Instagram at Rooted Healing Co, or find us on the various platforms you tune into. And don't forget to rate and review the show if these stories and conversations are touching you. It's a beautiful act of reciprocity. Thank you. The music in this episode was gifted by Mike Howe, Chris Park, and Kiara Gilmore. Thank you so much for enriching this episode with your creations. If you'd like to gift your music to the Rooted Healing podcast, please reach out to us via the link in the show notes. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.